Amory Blaine, or Amory Blaine, or heck, Amory Blaine. I don't know how to pronounce it, and you probably shouldn't worry about it either. For the purpose of this episode, we'll be going with Amory, a man, or should I say, a boy, who, like most of us, can't seem to find our way in the world. But whilst most of us just end up getting on with it, Amory often pauses to consider the social dynamics of his very being, and appears to suffer quite often from something of an existential crisis throughout the story. Many who read this book are often baffled, and rightfully so. Is it a novel, or is it a play? Is it a biography, or is it a fictional work? And perhaps more importantly, what even is the plot about? Spoiler alert, there isn't really a plot. It's pretty much just the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Amory Blaine is F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author of the book, and the author seems to live vicariously through Amory to provide us with the narrative of his own experiences. Narcissist? Absolutely. But despite this, we can gather some visceral insights as to what life was like in the Jazz Age, and through Fitzgerald's vivid storytelling, we are able to get a glimpse as to what life might have been like for a 20-something-year-old growing up in the 1920s. Whilst many doubt the book's purpose, and believe me, I've read this thing like 10 times now, we can at the very least appreciate the grace and lyrical magnificence of Fitzgerald's writing. There's also the contextual image it provides us, where it gives us a first-hand look at what one might have come to expect in the once new era of American history. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Amory Blaine, and for the next few minutes, we'll be exploring this side of paradise. Book 1, Chapter 1, Amory, Son of Beatrice. The story has an abrupt beginning of Amory from his childhood years, where we are introduced to his mother, Beatrice Blaine, a wealthy dame who is educated, beautiful, wealthy, and of course, mentally unstable. We are given a very brief introduction to Amory's father, Stephen Blaine, before he is shuffled out of the picture and never mentioned again. Basically, he was never that important, and had a minimal role in Amory's development. We don't know too much about the family dynamic, but we can gather that Beatrice and Stephen had a loveless, monotonous marriage, with the only significant accomplishment being Amory himself. Now, Beatrice and Amory have a unique mother-son relationship. First of all, Beatrice prefers to be called Beatrice by Amory instead of mother, because she is far too fond of her own name, but also because their relationship is less parental and more friendly. Whilst Beatrice provides for her son through tutors, fine dinners, and the benefits of high society, one might say she uses Amory as a prop to supplement her own luxurious lifestyle. It becomes a bragging right for her to her contemporary sophisticated friends, and she boasts of his natural intelligence and good looks to all who will listen. Both her and Amory travel the country together, and there is a chasm-like absence in these excursions of Amory's father, who is actually replaced, at least in terms of a father figure, with an old flame of Beatrice named Monsignor Darcy, a man who opted to join the church instead of marrying Beatrice. Some might say he dodged a bullet. Yet we see Monsignor Darcy become a heavy influence for Amory, and surely a man who he looks up to far more than his own bland father. But in the meantime, Amory is subject to seeing his mother experience multiple nervous breakdowns. When she was healthy, Amory was seen to be spoiled by his mother, pampered in fact, to the point that it would seem she would come to dote on him as if he was her only respite from a world that had in some manner done her wrong. Yet with the frequent mental breakdowns, it would not do for Amory to be around such circumstances, and so before long, he was shipped off to his uncle and aunt, and left to live with them in Minneapolis. By this point, Amory is 13 years of age, and this is essentially where the story picks off and continues. We learn that Amory is a gifted young man in academics, but that he also allows this to go to his head, where he views himself as superior to others, something that resides in his subconscious through the duration of his life. He excels at history, languages, and literature, but fails somewhat at athletics. Amory, who the story tells us has been invited to a party of a girl in his class named Myra St. Clair, decides to show up fashionably late, because even back then, we still found a way to play mind games with the women we secretly fancied. Amory here in his youth attempts to portray himself as more mature than he actually is, and even goes as far as to manipulate the poor girl into believing he was in a car accident, hence his lateness to the party. His false maturity also extends to him telling her that he is a smoker, something which poor Myra believes immediately and sympathizes with. Yes, Amory Blaine is a shrewd little boy who knows how to pull on a lady's heartstrings to pacify them and attract them. The two talk in private for a time before Amory makes his move and the two innocents kiss. Well, I say innocent. Amory proves to be far more conniving, or at least confused. After their kiss, Amory becomes immediately repulsed, and he rejects Myra, effectively ruining her party. His sudden repulsion towards kissing her is probably less of a commitment issue though, and more of a reflection of his youth, and that he wasn't quite ready for such intimacy at this age. Beyond this, we see the teenage years of Amory shaped as him being a lady killer, a conceited intellectual, and above all, a dreamer. He dreams fame and fortune for himself, dreams of honor and valor, and ultimately of himself becoming a noteworthy man. Under his own insecurities sprites a belief that he's destined for greatness, though manifesting such greatness proves to be a battle he enrolls in for the rest of his life. When Amory leaves his uncle and aunts, he returns to his mother Beatrice in Lake Geneva, where he requests to attend a boarding school on the principle that he has become conventional. It is decided that he will attend St. Regis School in Connecticut, where he departs from his mother and meets with the aforementioned Monsignor Darcy, Beatrice's old flame and now a man of the church. Both he and Amory form an instant bond. Amory's time at St. Regis is mostly normal, although he is seen to be the cause of disdain because of his simmering arrogance. The other boys consider him egotistical, whilst his teachers consider him undisciplined. Both are probably right, given that Amory proves to struggle not just in his social standing, but in his own academic studies too. Yet despite his previous misgivings with athletics, he becomes pretty good at football, on the account that he realizes that becoming good at sport was a fast lane to becoming popular, and earns the presence as something of a hero on campus. It is with the following attitude that Amory drifts into his teenage years with. He thinks of himself as exceedingly handsome, a dangerous charmer, a man, not a boy, who could swoon any woman and dominate his contemporaries. As for his mentality, his intellectualism, and his mind in general, he considered himself undoubtedly superior to everyone. It is at St. Regis that Amory comes to coin two terms that he uses to categorize his fellow contemporaries. First there is the slicker, and then there is the big man. The slicker, according to Amory, had a clever sense of social values, dressed well, pretends that dress is superficial, but knows that it isn't, participates only in activities he knows he's good at, and becomes successful in a worldly way. His hair is slicked. The big man, meanwhile, was thought to be inclined to stupidity and unconscious of social values. He thinks dress is superficial and doesn't care about it. He participates in everything regardless of his talents, goes to college, and has a problematic future whilst feeling lost and lonely. His hair is not slicked. It is amongst this category that Amory places himself, on the account that he views himself to indeed be stupid and unconscious of social values, to some degree, and perhaps more book smart than street smart. But it is with this creation of the slicker and the big man do we begin to see the first instances of his obsession with social boundaries and how he and others fit into them. Book 1, Chapter 2, Spires and Gargoyles. After St. Regis, Amory is seen to attend Princeton University, where he meets his roommates, Kerry and Byrne Holiday. The three form an instant friendship, where they share poetry, philosophy, and attempt to understand their social surroundings, and the world itself, at a greater depth. In an attempt to ferry his popularity from St. Regis as a footballer, Amory joins the Princetonian team, but ends up getting injured, which puts an end to that dream. Instead, he turns to his literary talents and joins the Daily Princetonian, which was a newspaper publication. But after having failed to achieve the popularity he believed was rightfully owed to him, he and Kerry become agitated, where they endlessly discuss why they aren't a part of the social elite. Amory makes a third friend out of Tom de Niveliers, who he spots reading a book, and the two become close intellectual friends, whereby Amory is introduced to new authors, new books, and new ideas. Coincidentally, World War I begins in Europe, but Amory shows very little interest in the conflict, both in soldiering and the greater political struggle. Instead, he becomes more focused on the Daily Princetonian newspaper and the Triangle Club, which was a musical theatre group that he had joined. Whilst a part of the Triangle Club, a trip across the country is organised, where Amory ends up meeting a girl named Isabel, a lady who acts rather unladylike for the time period, a woman who drinks, smokes, acts promiscuous, and a woman who doesn't seem too concerned about the social stigma. Naturally, Amory falls in love with her, and the two end up sending many letters to each other. The Daily Princetonian actually starts to do pretty well, and Amory is able to achieve the heights of recognition that he had always sought. He is projected into a more elite status on the campus, and even gains admittance into the Cottage, which was an elite club. It is around this time that we are introduced to more of Amory's elite contemporaries, including Alex Connage, Dick Humbird, and Jesse Ferrenby, those who, along with Kerry Holiday, end up going to the coast for a weekend away. They prove to be a most toxic group, however, where, because of their lack of funds, deem it appropriate to dine and dash at various restaurants. Other times they are seen to be underpaying for perfectly good food, and conduct themselves mostly in a drunken and belligerent manner. One member of their party stands out to Amory the most, and this is Dick Humbird, who Amory comes to idolize. He takes notes of the way he walks, the way he talks, and the way he conducts himself in every interaction. He thinks Humbird to be a perfect aristocrat, a slender man who has straight features and dresses quite well. Beyond this, Amory goes on to note him as courageous, funny, and charming, which is more than he says about his other companions. Sometime later, Amory is seen to be attending a party in New York with friends, and the night appears to be a merry one. But tragedy strikes in quite possibly the most dramatic thing that happens in the entire story, where Dick Humbird is killed in a car accident. something that Amory is arguably never quite able to get over. Why it affects him so badly is never really detailed, but one might say this death was the first real death that Amory experiences, and that this is one of the first people he has known to die. At least, one that he had looked up to and valued in some regard. In the following weeks, Amory ends up inviting Isabel to go with him to the prom. The two are described as being violently in love, and Amory ends up going to visit her and her family at their estate in Long Island, in what he expects to be a divinely romantic experience. But he's wrong. Book 1, Chapter 3. The Egotist Considers. Instead, they end up breaking up. I know, I was shocked too. To be honest, they break up over what seems to be the most pointless argument ever, and if I'm going to be honest, I'm with Amory on this one. So what ends up happening is that at some point, Amory goes to hug Isabel, and when he does, his shirt stud hurts her neck and leaves a mark. Because of this, Isabel completely overreacts and deems Amory as being a complete egotist, a man who cares only about himself and nothing else. Realizing that they are probably not each other's cup of tea, Amory leaves, and the relationship is over. Moral of the story, don't wear shirt studs. Or maybe don't date someone so volatile? Amory is seen to be doing pretty piss poor at school as well, as he starts failing courses and is forced to resit exams. Even with ultimatums that threaten his position at the newspaper and his overall success at Princeton, he doesn't seem to care, and ultimately ends up failing everything. With this, instead of opting to recognize his own faults and to try hard the next time, Amory decides that he failed because he tried too much to be something that he wasn't, and that in failing the exam, he has discovered a new part of himself. That part being the fundamental Amory. Amory's father, Stephen Blaine, unfortunately passes away during this time. But if Amory cared, he shows little sign of it. Instead, he is drawn towards the inheritance aspect of his father's death, and the crushing realization that neither of his parents were particularly good with money, having made several fruitless investments. With this, there are diminishing returns, those that threaten the lifestyle that Amory had always envisioned for himself. After having buried his father, Amory returns to the man who he probably wished was his father, Monsignor Darcy. It is here that they discuss the difference between a personality and a personage. This very distinction going on to influence Amory profoundly in the coming years. To have a personality, as Monsignor Darcy explains, is to be someone who is constant and unwavering, whilst to have a personage is to be someone who is malleable, who gains experiences that shape the outlook of their life. It is with these infuriatingly vague philosophications that become a staple of their relationship. In his time remaining at Princeton, Amory fades out of the limelight and adopts something of a low profile. Some of his friends, including Kerry Holiday, leave to enlist in the army, something that Amory admires greatly. Frequently throughout the book, Amory would find sanctuary in New York, where Monsignor Darcy lived, and it would be here in New York that Amory would experience one of the biggest shocks of his life, perhaps a paranormal one. In one drunken escapade, Amory is out with a friend and two girls, where he spots a man staring at him in a bar. This man, for some strange reason, confounds Amory, and Amory becomes certain that he is of evil intentions. The sight of this man causes Amory to flee into the alley, where he begins to experience what one might describe as a panic attack. He becomes inconsolable, believing that there was certainly something malevolent about the man he had seen. With this, he collapses to the ground, and is horrified to see the ghost of Dick Humbird. his friend who had been killed in the car crash. Returning home, Amory explains what he'd seen to Tom de Nivelles, where to his horror, Tom sees the devil himself, watching Amory. Many have come to question the relevance of the devil in this part of the story, and there is some idea that the devil was the man who had been watching Amory in the bar. But still, this devil does not appear again, and naturally, some were baffled as to why it was even included in the story. Whilst Amory does not question this sighting again, it could be Fitzgerald using the devil to foreshadow the subsequent events of Amory's life, those which some might say are like hell itself. With the presence of the devil, it might be said that Satan had come to fetch Amory and to escort him through the door that would lead to hard times, emotional suffering, and of course, complete depression. Book 1, Chapter 4 Narcissus of Duty. By Amory's senior year, he comes to learn that there are brewing tensions amongst the juniors, and that Burn Holiday has riled them up to resign their clubs as a form of protest, something that was characteristic of Burn, who we learn was a bit of a prankster. Whilst Amory had been closer with Burn's brother Kerry, Amory soon becomes close friends as well with Burn, and it is Burn who reignites the intellectual fire in Amory, and prompts him to make better choices. With this, Amory attempts to emulate Burn in typical Burn fashion, and proceeds to invite some eccentric guests to a dinner party, in an effort to sabotage the cottage club. During this time, Monsignor Darcy writes to Amory, and asks him to visit a relative in Philadelphia, a widow named Clara. Whilst Amory grants this favour to Monsignor Darcy, he isn't too happy about it, and admits he is disappointed when he first lays eyes on her. But in typical Amory fashion, nothing to him is as it seems, and within a few days, he has fallen in love with Clara. In the blink of an eye, she is suddenly beautiful and witty, and while she too finds him charming and handsome, she does declare that she has never been in love, and certainly is not in love with him. Interestingly, Clara proves to be not like the other women Amory has found easy to swoon, and instead sees through his bravado. She believes that he is putting up a facade, and that his confidence is merely a wall to shield his more vulgar insecurities. She also deems that his lack of willpower in applying himself to work and study is less about him being lazy, but instead about him possessing poor judgment. Amory, who had up until this point believed himself to be irresistible to women, encounters what might be the first smart, mature, and independent woman he's ever known, someone who can unpick him better than he can unpick himself. She exposes him as a narcissist in ways that no other person can, and deflates his ego to the point that Amory is completely disarmed. When the war reaches America, Amory and the others set off to serve. Burn Holiday, however, decides that he is a pacifist, and with that, he sells everything he owns and rides off on a bicycle. He and Amory do not meet again. With his time at university at its conclusion, Amory and Tom de Nivelles bid Princeton an emotional farewell, where some might say Amory leaves behind the happiest years of his life. Interlude, May 1917 to February 1919. We then see the story take a complete plunge, both narratively and structurally, as the format of the novel changes into a short section detailing Amory's time in war. This takes place in the form of 2 letters to Monsignor Darcy, where Monsignor Darcy laments over warfare in general, and regrets that he was not Amory's father himself. He proceeds to praise Amory for his character, charm, and wit, and speaks of the bond between them, where he considers Amory to be something of a reincarnation of himself. In the second letter, Amory writes to Tom de Nivelles of his plans after the war, where he plans to get an apartment and hopes to enter politics. He also speaks of the death of his mother Beatrice, though does not lament much on her passing away, but instead feels bitter that she had chosen to leave half of her money to the church and not him. Another death which appears to have taken place during this time is Kerry Holiday, his friend and roommate from Princeton, who Amory reveals perished on the battlefield. Yet despite these grave occurrences, Amory, without fail, is able to center the subject around himself, and tells Tom that he ultimately fears growing fat or falling in love. Book 2, Chapter 1, The Debutante. The structure of the novel is warped yet again, and randomly transforms itself into a play with stage directions. The scene takes focus on Rosalind Connage at her house in New York, and we understand her to be something of a high noble girl who's getting ready for a party. We understand that Rosalind is beautiful, sophisticated, and of course, spoiled. The perfect type of woman for our hapless hero Amory Blaine to fall intensely in love with. Amory, who we know was good friends with her brother Alec, and also a roommate with himself and Tom de Nivelles, visits their home after his stint in the war, and his fears of falling in love were about to become realized in what is perhaps the most important love affair in Amory's life. He accidentally enters her dressing room, though Rosalind doesn't seem to mind the intrusion. The two engage in some of the most pretentious upper-class ramblings ever known to man, and within the space of a few minutes, decide that they are in love and proceed to make out. Apparently, this is how it worked back in the 1920s. Rosalind pretty much tells Amory that she's kissed a lot of men, a kiss being a polite euphemism for much, much more, and that she will probably kiss many more men. Well, at least she's honest, eh? This self-proclaimed promiscuity isn't a red flag for Amory Blaine, however, and he proceeds to fall further and further in love with her. In fact, it's here he coins an infamous distinction between people who are romantic and people who are sentimental. Put simply, a sentimentalist believes that their relationships will last, whilst a romantic secretly hopes that they won't. With this, Amory identifies himself as being in the latter category. He goes to kiss her again, probably thinking himself suave and debonair after all that talk, but she refuses him and determines that she has won their exchange, implying that this whole thing was nothing more than a contest for her. Rosalind's mother is then seen to be explaining to her the best methods in attracting a wealthy man. No, not a good man, a wealthy man. Good to know she has her priorities straight. She speaks of a man named Dawson Ryder, and believes him to be the ideal match for her. With this, Rosalind entertains Dawson Ryder, but after a brief conversation, she realizes that he lacks everything that Amory is, and then, in the blink of an eye, she falls in love with Amory. The story then abruptly switches back to its novel format, and we are told of how Amory and Rosalind spend many passionate months together, and are deeply in love with one another. Amory takes a job at a soulless advertising agency, in an effort to sustain not only his own gaudy lifestyle, but to also satisfy the extravagant wants and needs of Rosalind. For the very first time, we see Amory drop the facades, mind games, and efforts to present himself as something that he isn't, and instead opens himself up quite honestly and genuinely. Here we see a man who isn't playing games anymore, because he's actually found someone he cares about more than himself. Amory is practically uncontrollable in his pairing with Rosalind, and you might say that he loses himself in the idea of the two of them being a couple. I mean, the guy even gets a job. The Amory Blaine we've come to know would laugh in pity at this Amory Blaine. Then the story rips us out of the novel format and shoves us back into the format of a play, and we bear witness to a conversation between Rosalind and her mother, who complains that Amory is not wealthy and therefore not a good match for her. With the increased hours of work and low pay in return, Amory becomes subdued and appears fatigued and haggard. Say what you will about him, he generally does try his best to put Rosalind first. But money, as it often does, plays too much of a factor in their relationship, and with the pressures of her mother and her lavish society, Rosalind breaks up with Amory, justifying this by telling him that if she was to remain with his low income, then she would no longer be the woman he fell in love with. She is forced to choose between her wealthy lifestyle and Amory Blaine, and would you believe it, she chooses her wealthy lifestyle. As you might imagine, Amory is devastated. In fact, you might say that Amory is never quite the same again after this experience. Despite everything that he has seen in his life, including the war itself, Rosalind's breaking up with him serves to be the single most traumatic thing he endures, and something that fuels many of his big decisions later on. Like many of us after a breakup, Amory vows never to fall in love again, and forces himself to adopt avoidant characteristics when faced with future prospective romances. An interesting side note to make is that this actually happened to the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, though he wins back his Rosalind by publishing this very book and making a bit of money. Book 2, Chapter 2, Experiments in Convalescence. Heartbroken, ruined, humiliated, and utterly devastated, Amory starts to drink. In fact, he is seen to drink for a full 3 weeks, where he makes a fool of himself in bars, wakes up in hotel rooms, gets into fights, and vomits in every alleyway in New York City. Pretty much a standard breakup, really. He goes completely off the rails, and goes through the standard shifting mindset of loving Rosalind and hating her. He is a mess. But he doesn't drunk text his ex, so fair play to him. It's an interesting parallel that breakups in the 1920s seemed to have more of a finality, and allowed for a more wholesome exit for the person being dumped, in that they had less means to reconnect with their ex. They couldn't stalk them on social media, couldn't drunk call or text them, and didn't get bent out of shape every time they changed their profile picture. I mean, no one ever drunk penned a letter, did they? Although to be honest, I wouldn't have put it past Amory. His descent into madness sees him quit his advertising job, given that he no longer has a need for it with no Rosalind, before returning home. Here he learns from Tom DeNivelliers that Alec Connage, Rosalind's brother, has moved out, and that they might not be able to afford the rent between just the two of them, causing the two to agree to live parsimoniously. Amory stashes all the mementos and letters of Rosalind and buries them in his trunk, before continuing his binge. But as if the world wasn't conspiring against Amory enough, the prohibition comes into place and stops Amory's drinking indefinitely. With this, Amory reluctantly accepts the end of his drunken misadventures and is forced to face the reality of a life without Rosalind. Whilst Amory's life seems like it's in the toilet, the breakup he has with Rosalind is actually a blessing in disguise. Much like all breakups, to be honest. The breakup not only frees him from a selfish and spoiled woman, but also frees him from a dead-end job that he hated. With all this, Amory had become what he describes later on as a spiritually married man. That is, a man who is tied down and does not live his true potential. Amory, in essence, had become someone that he wasn't meant to be when he was with Rosalind, and so by ending their relationship, Rosalind actually saves Amory from a dire, loathsome fate that he eventually would have resented himself. But incidentally, it also shows how much Amory actually loved Rosalind, in that he was willing to bear these burdens if it meant they could be together. Of course, you might also say that Amory was delusional, as we often are in love. But for this time of his life, a new type of Amory emerged, one who was revealed to have a bigger heart than previously suggested. But things get worse before they get better, for Tom de Nivelles moves out of the apartment to care for his mother, leaving Amory with no choice but to leave as well. He heads to Maryland to stay with an uncle, and whilst there, the next chapter of his life begins to rapidly unfold. Like many of us who have sworn off love in the past, Amory finds himself coming back for more, for it is here in Maryland that he meets Eleanor. Book 2, Chapter 3, Young Irony. The narrator provides some background details about how Amory and Eleanor came to meet, and in typical Fitzgeraldness, it comes down to a flatulent encounter where Amory is reciting Poe whilst walking through the country. Indeed, there appears to have been a time where people would walk through the countryside reciting poetry into the open air. But on his walk, there is a sudden emergence of a storm, which forces him to rush through a field in search of shelter. It is here in a haystack that he hears someone also reciting poetry, the woman he would come to know as Eleanor. Amory joins her in the haystack, and the two engage in conversation before realizing that they have a lot in common. At this part of the story, readers, including myself, were shouting at the book, "Don't do it, Amory. Don't simp out again. Don't you dare." But of course, despite his best efforts to escape love, Amory runs straight back into it, and the two end up parting with a goodnight kiss. But at least Eleanor seems to be less self-centered, and more in line with Amory's ideals. For one, the two actually appear to share something in common, a love of literature, and she seems far less preoccupied with meeting the expectations of society and her family. We learn that she has already become estranged from her family because of her apparent wildness, and she moved from France to Baltimore to live with her grandfather. It is because of this very wildness and her disassociation from societal expectations that enamors Amory in the first place, for Eleanor is simply like no other woman he has met before. The two spend a lot of time together, and in many ways, it is this relationship that might very well be one of Amory's more healthy ones. Though don't build your hopes up. It is far from a wholesome relationship. Whilst there is more substance in this relationship, and Eleanor proves to be superior in intellect when compared to Rosalind, the relationship still fails, on the account that Amory isn't fully over Rosalind yet, and that Eleanor is actually a bit of a fruitcake. On the night before Amory plans to leave Baltimore, he and Eleanor end up riding horses out to a cliff, where Amory predicts, and quite accurately in my opinion, that Eleanor will renounce her wild ways on her deathbed and beg for a priest to absolve her. To this, Eleanor has the totally reasonable response of galloping her horse to the edge of the cliff. At the last moment, she flings herself from the saddle, right before the horse goes over the edge, and saves herself from what is perceived to be a possible suicide attempt. The horse is not so lucky and tumbles to its death. Naturally, Amory is shaken up after seeing this, and is all the more quick to leave Baltimore after this outburst. Still, the two do exchange love letters in the years after this dark conclusion, but they never see each other again. Perhaps another reason why this relationship didn't work, besides the obvious insanity, is that Eleanor was simply far too unconventional for Amory, and that both she and Rosalind were two polarized extremes of what he really wanted. With this episode, It might be said that Amory would have sought after something in between, but after these incidents was far too scarred to even try. In fact, Eleanor appears to be his final romantic encounter, and it is with her that he turns away from romance for good, finding himself far too emotionally drained to entertain the idea, let alone another heartbreak. Yet, this is where the tragedy becomes apparent, because Amory, deep down, wants to fall in love. But now, after everything he's seen, he is too afraid, or at least, too cautious. Love here becomes the poison and the antidote, both of which accentuate the ever-growing void in himself. Book 2, Chapter 4, The Supercilia Sacrifice. Amory is then seen in Atlantic City, watching the sea, when he is suddenly approached by none other than Alec Connage, the older brother of Rosalind, who he was once roommates with. It really seems like a small world, doesn't it? Alec Connage is with a few women, who are possibly prostitutes, and he invites Amory to join them in socializing. But Amory, who is still seen to be lamenting not only on Rosalind, but also on the deaths of Carrie Holiday and Dick Humbird, is in no mood for any shenanigans. However, he does head back with Alec to his hotel room, where he falls asleep. He awakens to a start when he hears banging on all the doors of the hotel room, and finds Alec and one of the girls to be in a panic. Those causing the commotion were house detectives, and this was something of a common occurrence during the time period, for they were trying to uphold the Mann Act of 1910, which made it illegal to transport any woman for the purpose of prostitution, debauchery, or any other immoral purpose. Whilst the law was conceived to prevent sexual slavery of women and to prosecute men having sex with underage girls, it was also used as a means to prevent extramarital relationships. Fitzgerald frames the act here as also serving as a form of entrapment, in an effort to publicly shame various individuals. Of course, Alec, who had in this essence violated the law in either hiring a woman or committing adultery, was bricking it, for he also had a family to worry about when this whole spectacle went public, which it often did. The offender was subject to not only fines, but also a space in the newspaper, where they were named and shamed. Alec's life was about to be utterly ruined. Amory ponders on the implications of this, though he seems to care less about the ramifications that Alec will face, and more about how heroic he himself will come across if he is able to take the fall instead. He soon reasons that he would be hurt much less by this scandal, because he has no one left he really cares about. And so, in what might be described as a supercilia sacrifice, Amory tells Alec to pretend that he's passed out drunk. He then takes the girl into the bathroom, where he knows the detectives will catch them, and proceeds to take responsibility for the crime. Amory convinces the detectives not to press charges, on the account that the hotel they are in did not want the negative publicity. Therefore, an agreement is made where Amory's name will appear in the newspaper, describing how he and a young woman had been a part of some debauchery. Seeing this as far more anecdotal than punishing, Amory readily agrees to these terms, and cheekily asks the detective to remove his hat, for he was in the presence of a lady. When he returns to New York, Amory finds the newspaper which printed his name in relation to the incident, and is rather amused by it. However, his amusement is cut short, for just above the article is another entry announcing the marriage of Rosalind and none other than that scumbag Dawson Ryder. You know, that guy who Rosalind's mother originally asked her to marry? And probably the same guy Rosalind told Amory not to worry about? Yeah, him. With this bombshell, Amory resigns himself to another bout of depression, and contemplates the idea that Rosalind is in essence dead, or at least the Rosalind he had once known is dead. Whilst he had mourned the death of their relationship, in some capacity, he now mourned her, for there was now absolutely no chance of them getting back together. Furthermore, there is another load of bad news when he learns that his family's investments have taken a nosedive, and as a result, he no longer has a steady income. Lost in the world around him, mourning the loss of Rosalind, and stuck without a penny to his name, it really couldn't get any worse, right? That is until he gets a telegram informing him that his beloved Monsignor Darcy has passed away. Book 2, Chapter 5. The Egotist becomes a personage. In the final chapter, we come to see Amory contemplate on rich people and poor people, where he decides he detests the latter. This is established by the realization that he is one of them, and he is forced to align himself, despite his intelligence, charm, and high hopes, amongst them. He has well and truly hit rock bottom, and he does not have the motivation to climb out of it, especially not when he considers the possibility of recapturing his former glory, only to lose it yet again. To Amory, staying here in this poor, almost meaningless state is far less painful than choosing to believe he could turn it around. He does not regret what has happened, but more so regrets that much of what has transpired was out of his hands, and that in the end, he had no more control over his fate than anyone else. We see him engage in a psychological debate with his own mind, where he begins to shoot questions at himself, those which he quickly supplies the answers to. He considers himself to be something of a furnace, an instrument which gives off heat to others, and that for all his life he has been a provider of emotional energy. Now though, he is drained, and he has no more heat to give off. We learn from this tirade of self-questioning that he is afraid of being poor, that he has no interest left, that he seeks to warm himself by others instead of warming them, and that he is corrupt, or at least unsure of what corruption even looks like. We know he is drifting, but where the destination is, no one can say. We see him shortly after attending Monsignor Darcy's funeral, where we see him reflect on his former father figure, as well as the likes of Kerry Holiday and Dick Humbird, all of whom were now gone in one sense or another. He considers Clara, Rosalind, Eleanor, and how none of his romantic relationships ever materialized into anything worthwhile. It is with these contemplations that Amory finds it in himself to conceive a noble thought and feeling, that he wants to provide people with security, perhaps the same security that he had only temporarily grasped. With no money to really do anything, Amory begins to trek back to Princeton, which may have been the only place in the world which he still possessed fond memories of. It was a place before Monsignor Darcy's death, before his 3-week bender, before the crushing realization of his own shortcomings, and before Rosalind. His memories of Princeton consisted of a time where he had a more concrete idea of what he wanted, even if it was still vastly vague, and it was a time he had a certain naive excitement about the world and what it had in store for him. In a sense, university made him feel like he was destined for greatness, and not the sore misery that had now become his life. It was a happier time for sure, and a time where perhaps on some level he wished to return to, because things were far simpler. Still, you might say actually going back there is a bit ridiculous, because it really wouldn't have achieved anything. But we all know Amory by now, and so he decides to walk his way back to Princeton. You might say his decision to walk is a peculiar one, but this might actually have been a demonstration of what little money he had left. This walk back to Princeton can also be akin to a pilgrimage of his happier years, a rite he must endure in order to consolidate his past. It is on this journey that he ends up hitchhiking with a wealthy man and his secretary, where the three end up discussing capitalism and socialism. Amory appears to attack the idea of capitalism, denounces the spiritually married man who benefits from an already established system, and promotes the spiritually unmarried man, who Amory deems is a facilitator of change and growth. It's interesting that Amory had once become the spiritually married man in an effort to please Rosalind, but seeing how that turned out, it's no wonder he condemns the idea now and opts to become its complete antithesis. The two men do not agree with the socialist ideas of Amory, and with some back and forth, neither is seen to concede on their ideas. Interestingly, it is unclear whether Amory really is a socialist, considering what we know of his more selfish traits, and considering the fact that he admits to wanting a revolution, not to establish the very change he spoke of, but instead because of the off chance that he might land on top of the social shift. Having held his own in the debate with the two men, Amory is feeling pretty pleased with himself. Though that feeling of pride only lasts for so long, for the wealthy man introduces himself as Mr. Ferrenby, the father of one Jesse Ferrenby, one of Amory's friends who had perished in the war. When Amory learns of who the man is, the wind is taken out of his sails, and he is reintroduced to the cold and often tragic reality of life. It is with this that he turns his attention back to his pilgrimage, and after speaking highly of Jesse, saying that he was a fine man, he sets off once more on the road back to Princeton. Whilst Amory continues his lonely walk, he comes to stop at a Civil War graveyard, where the headstones remind him of all his failed opportunities at love. Despite this, he does make it back to Princeton at midnight, and stares on with pity at the new students who he believes are on their way to becoming conformists to the system, something he knows he can never be. With this, he makes some peace with himself in finally understanding the man he has become, and declares in some clarity that he knows himself, but that is all. Depending on the version of the text, the final sentence of Amory comes under some scrutiny, with some editions ending with a full stop and others ending with a dash. Whilst this might seem minor, it does have some implications that spell two somewhat different endings, as far as Amory goes. A full stop suggests that Amory does know himself, and that is the end of it. He knows himself, and this is seemingly the way it is, and always will be. But a dash, however, leaves our hapless hero in a floating state, implying that he knows himself at this very moment, but that this knowledge is fleeting. It implies that Amory will continue to grow and change, where he will know himself with varying degrees of understanding. Basically, in this version, Amory's story is not over, and there is some hope that he will find a happiness more congruent with his deepest desires. If you've enjoyed today's episode on This Side of Paradise and the adventure, or misadventure, of one Amory Blaine, then do leave it a like and let me know what your thoughts were in the comments below. Also, if you're new here, I also run the channel Legends of History if you're interested in history and mythology, so be sure to subscribe to both channels to keep notified for more content. Until next time.